proposals. The 40 refers to the unfulfilled promise the United States made to our enslaved ancestors when they were, quote, freed. They were told that after the Civil War, they would get 40 acres and a mule. Hasn't happened. Our second goal is to get more people engaged, people like yourselves, so that we can move this needle forward, so that Black reparations are provided in our lifetime and for generations yet unborn. So let us begin, as our faith tradition requires, with scripture and prayer, which will be led by Minister Peyton Silkett, who is a member of the Word Christian Center and a community organizer with Faith in Action. That would be followed with opening remarks from our beloved and prophetic pastor, Dr. Jacqueline A. Thompson. She will introduce our beloved and courageous Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who will also bring us greetings. But before we start, we want you to hear a voice from our past that resonates so much in our future. That is the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you again for being here today.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Officers also reportedly chased and fired on a radio-equipped car containing 2 white men. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of a second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet...
Good morning, everyone. I am so excited that you all are joining us today. For those of you who do not know me, I am Dr. Jacqueline Thompson, the proud senior pastor of Allen Temple Baptist Church. I see some of you in the chat, but just let us know you are here. So I know some of you have been typing good morning, so just let us know you are here. We are so glad that you are here, and we are asking that you take an opportunity and share this incredible conversation with someone right now. We're so very grateful on behalf of Allen Temple Baptist Church that you have joined us, and we are grateful to the leaders of our public ministry for hosting this important conversation. If anything that opening video did for us, it let us know that there is work still yet to be done. That is why we are here today, because there is still a work yet to be undone. And I know there are many who are wondering, we've been having reparations conversation. Why are we still having this conversation? Because we still need reparations. You will hear discussions today about the wealth gap between Black families, white families, and even around the world. And we need to be able to engage around all of the issues, not just voting rights, but the issues of economic justice that are impacting our community today. If the COVID pandemic has not done anything, it has revealed the tragedy of the disparities that exist in our community compared with other communities. It has revealed the weaknesses of our system and the desegregation in education, in healthcare, and the digital divide that still exists today, partly because for 250 years, our ancestors who were slaves helped build the wealth of this nation, and yet they were not paid for their labor. So that's what this conversation is really about. There is a debt to be paid to us. And we are coming together to pool our resources, our skills, our talents, our intellect, and to support our political leaders who are engaging this fight so we can make sure that that wealth equity gap is closed. And so again, thank you so much for being here. Please engage in the chat. We have an incredible panel today. And with that in mind, it is my honor and my privilege to introduce one who really needs no introduction. She is our representative. She represents what she calls the wokest district there is in the United States. Help me welcome in the chat our very own Congresswoman of the 13th District, Barbara Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Pastor Jackie. Thank you for that very spirited and loving introduction. But also, I just have to thank you for your unbelievable, tremendous leadership, not only in terms of our community, but throughout the country, and being in the vanguard of so many social justice and economic justice movements, and making sure it's put in the context of our Christian faith. And this is such an important moment to have my church, Allen Temple Baptist Church. Allie, I just want to thank you, the public ministries, to really, once again, being in the vanguard of all these issues. So thank you all again, and it's really good to see everybody. Let me take a moment to express my gratitude to my colleague, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who we work together with each and every day to make, as our beloved Congressman John Lewis said, good trouble. And this good trouble, and I'm so glad you played the Dr. King introduction, because Dr. King was truly a revolutionary. Here he was talking about addressing systemic racism and repairing the damage way back in the day. And so systemic racism and the legacy of slavery continues to harm African Americans in in all aspects of life, from education to healthcare, to the housing crisis, to the wealth gap. Of course, the criminal justice reform is in the DNA of America. And so part of this effort is we must offer sweeping reparations to address the inequities, but we have to dismantle those systems, first of all, that still exist in this country and every institution. The United States has paid reparations to marginalized groups who suffered as a result of government-sponsored discrimination and racism. But we have never even determined what reparations means for the hundreds of years of enslaving Africans, the theft of Black assets and land, and the generations of economic inequality and discrimination, all of which the US government supported and benefited from. This was a legal system that in many respects is still in place. And so the role of the federal government in supporting the institution of enslaving men, women, and children and subsequent racism and discrimination directed against African American is an injustice that must be formally acknowledged and redressed. And this government-sanctioned legal system of enslaving Black people has got to be dismantled. And so this discussion is so important. I just want to add the truth, racial healing, and transformation component, which Congresswoman Jacqueline Lee and myself are working on HR 19, because many countries around the world have taken steps to have these truth-telling moments predicated on truth of the historic injustices. Over 40 countries have established these. Without acknowledging the truth, racial healing never takes place. We've never had this moment in our country to really bring forth the descendants of enslaved Africans, to really lay out the public record, the history, and the truth-telling of what took place that continues today as it manifested in systemic racism. And so HR 40, our commission, HR 19, the transformation provisions is reparations, not only to study, but to develop reparations. These proposals are a necessary step to root out racism and discrimination. And finally, I'll just say I was so proud to be with Congresswoman Jacqueline Lee the evening that HR 40 passed out of the Judiciary Committee. And let me tell you, I was Ron Dellums and John Conyers in the late 80s. Both were the only two co-sponsors of HR 40. Congresswoman Jacqueline Lee took the ball when Congressman Conyers passed away and has moved HR 40 through the House Judiciary Committee. I'm not on the Judiciary Committee, but I sat through that 6 or 7 hour hearing that night. And I want to tell you, if you can get a record of that hearing, listen to the racist and bogus and disingenuous arguments by the Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee. Every single Democrat voted for it. They got it. And Congresswoman Jacqueline Lee, she led the debate in a masterful and brilliant manner. And so just know this is a political struggle. It's a political struggle. HR 40 is out of finally, the Judiciary Committee sitting on the floor of Congress with over 200 co-sponsors to get it passed. And so my charge is, look, as we have this panel and discuss what's next, just really help us get all of our California congressional delegation members, everyone around the country, to say to our speaker and to those who allow bills to get to the floor by sequencing them, that HR 40 needs to come to the floor right away. Thank you all again. I want to salute our esteemed panelists and thank you for giving me a chance to be with you today. This is long overdue.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Lee. And we want to salute you for always taking a stand, being on the right side of history, and not being afraid to stand alone when it's required to stand alone. We are honored and blessed to have you as our representative, and our temple is blessed to call you a member of our church. We are a community of faith, and so we dare not begin this wonderful panel without opening with a word of scripture and a word of prayer. But by way of transition, I like the engagement that is going on in the chat. Please continue that. I saw a comment that pops up that says, reparations can't fix racism, and that's a true story. Reparations cannot fix racism, but guess what? It can help the damage that has been done by racism, and that is the purpose of this conversation today. And so we seek the Lord's blessing, and we're grateful for Minister Payton, who is joining us this morning, who is going to give us our opening scripture and opening prayer.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Jackie. And thank you, everybody, for being on today. Our opening scripture reading comes today from Matthew chapter 5, verse 23, and it says, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift." That scripture passage really spoke to me because I believe America has been trying to make offerings at the altar without first being reconciled to its brothers and sisters. Our prayer comes today, I found it most appropriate, by Paul Lawrence Dunbar, whose parents, he's an American poet, and his parents were born in slavery. I'll read the final 3 stanzas, and that will serve as our prayer today. He says, "When foes press upon me, let me not quail, nor think to turn into a coward's flight. I only ask to make mine arms prevail, strength for the fight. Still let my eyes look ever on the foe. Still let my armor case me strong and bright, and grant me as I deal each righteous blow, strength for the fight. And when at eventide the fray is done, my soul to death's bedchamber do thou light, and give me, be the field lost or won, rest from the fight. I pray that as we continue to go into this, God, that you just grant us strength for this fight. Amen.
And now we are very pleased to begin this conversation. We are honored to have as our moderators today our own Reverend Jeremy McCants, who is the Minister of Prophetic Justice at Allen Temple and co-chair of the Public Ministry Committee. Also moderating with him is our own member, Attorney Melanie Gross, who is also, Melanie Gross, who is also a member of the Public Ministry Committee. So I will begin by introducing our esteemed panelists. We are grateful to have Dr. Joseph Evans. Dr. Evans serves as Dean of the Morehouse School of Religion in Atlanta, Georgia, where also he serves as an associate professor of preaching for all affiliated schools of the Interdenominational Theological Center. Dean Evans has served 2 Baptist churches as pastor, and most recently, he served the historic Mount Carmel Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. He earned his Master of Divinity degree in systematic theology and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in preaching. Dean Evans has written several publications, including one we hope you will all order from Judson Press today. That is Reconciliation and Reparation, Preaching Economic Justice, with a foreword from our own Pastor Emeritus, Dr. Alfred Smith, Sr. Our next panelist is Ms. Darlene Flynn. Ms. Flynn has been the director of the Department of Race and Equity for the City of Oakland since fall of 2016. She came with over a decade of experience as one of the original architects of the now nationally recognized model, Seattle Race and Social Justice Initiative. In Oakland, she is working with a small department of racial equity team and staff across the city to implement the equity mission of the city, which is to intentionally integrate on a citywide basis the principle of fair and just in all the city does to achieve equitable opportunities for all people and communities. We welcome Dr. Jovan Scott Lewis, who is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Geography at the University of California, Berkeley. There, he also co-leads the Economic Disparities Research Program at the Othering and Belonging Institute. He received his PhD in anthropology from the London School of Economics. His research focuses on the social and economic disparities faced by Black communities in North America and the reparation models required to respond to those histories of inequality. He is the author of Scammer's Yard, The Crime of Black Repair in Jamaica, and Violent Utopia, Dispossession and Restoration in Tulsa, which traces the consequences of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. In 2021, he was appointed by California Governor Gavin Newsom to serve on the state's Reparations Task Force. We are pleased to welcome Mr. Chris Lodgson, who is lead organizer with the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California, should be society, CJEC. This is a statewide organization working for reparations and reparative justice in California. CJEC was instrumental in the passage of AB 3121, the law that created California's first in the nation reparations task force. He's originally from New York, now living in California. He has organized both independently and with local community-based organizations, as well as with national nonprofit organizations. In addition, Chris is also a legal researcher, freelance writer, entrepreneur, and strong advocate for Black-owned businesses. And we have Kamilah Moore, chair of the California Reparations Task Force. Attorney Moore is a reparatory justice scholar and an attorney with a specialization in entertainment and intellectual property transactions. As a law student, Attorney Moore contributed to human rights reports related to domestic and international human rights issues, including but not limited to racial inequality in Brazil, the human right to sanitation in Lowndes County, Alabama. And then while studying abroad at the University of Amsterdam, Moore wrote a master thesis exploring the intersections between international law and reparatory justice for the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and their legacies. She earned a Juris Doctor degree from Columbia Law School in New York City, a Master Law degree in International Criminal Law from the University of Amsterdam, and a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. She was appointed to the California Reparations Task Force, for which she serves as chair by Speaker of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon. And last but not least on our panel now is our own Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who we love. Congresswoman Barbara Lee co-sponsored H.R. 40, which is the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals. She has co-authored every major piece of legislation dealing with global HIV/AIDS issues since she was elected to Congress. Congresswoman Lee currently serves as a member of the House Appropriations Committee. She's chair of the Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, co-chair of the Steering and Policy Committee, co-chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus Health Task Force, and co-chair of the Pro-Choice Caucus and chair of the Majority Leaders Task Force on Poverty and Opportunity. As a member of the House Democratic leadership, she is the highest ranking African American woman in the US Congress. So we have this powerful, esteemed group of, I just can't say, they're just powerful. And so we're ready, Attorney Melanie and Reverend Jeremy. So it is in your hands.
Greetings, greetings. Thank you, Dr. Whitehurst, for these lovely introductions. The chat is ablaze. I put in there earlier that we know that this is a very heated topic. We are grateful that you all are expressing your ideas and your beliefs, but we ask that you govern yourselves with love and grace and know that this is a conversation of how we are to educate ourselves and how to come together as a community to move forward. So please, family, utilize the chat for sure, but use love and grace at your discretion. So to everyone who's been introduced, I know we're ready to get into it. So I am going to start with a blanketed question, and then we will move into some specific panelist questions. So the first blanket question will be, some say that there is the mistaken impression that racial equity initiatives and reparations are equivalent. I'll say it again. Some say that there is the mistaken impression that racial equity initiatives and reparations are equivalent. How do you define reparations? So we will start that. I know Congresswoman Barbara Lee, she is on the time crunch. So we will start with her, moving backwards with after Congresswoman Lee, we will go to Mr. Lodgson. Then we will go to Dr. Lewis, Ms. Flynn, Attorney Moore, and ending with Dr. Evans.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, let me just say this. Racial equity initiatives, quote, diversity and lessening disparities, these are all good initiatives, but they don't address the systemic issues that are in the DNA of this country, and that is the direct connection to the transatlantic slave trade of enslaved Africans. And that's the issue. And we've made a lot of progress in the civil rights movement and in the human rights movement, but we have never dealt with the dismantling of those systems that have given rise to systemic racism that impact our lives each and every day. And so, yes, America has really, as Dr. King said, defaulted on its promissory note. It has a sacred obligation, and it's got to stop turning a blind eye to the suffering of African Americans under institutional racism. So diversity, racial equity, racial inclusion, I don't even like to use the term diversity anymore. It's about racial justice. All these are absolutely essential, but these are incremental measures. We need to right now finally get to the bottom of this, have a truth-telling moment so we can move toward racial healing and reparations. And that involves dismantling all of those systems which emanated from enslaving men, women, and children, Africans, for over 250 years.
I'm going to jump in here. This is Chris Lodgson with CJEC, and just follow up with what the Congresswoman said. But first, before I even get to that, I do want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank everyone who's in the chat. I want to thank God actually for allowing me to be a part of this amazing work. And I want to remind everybody that we are sitting in a history book right now. We have never been this close to reparations. I want to say that again. We have never been this close to reparations. So everyone in here is literally sitting inside of a history book right now. I wanted to start there. Secondly, I want to get to your question. Reparations, the way I think of it, is a set of policies, benefits, and programs designed specifically to redress a historic harm. In our case, slavery, Jim Crow, Jane Crow, and ongoing racism and discrimination, specifically designed for those of us who descend from US slavery. Generally speaking, reparations has 3 goals, in my estimation: acknowledgement, redress, and closure. And it takes about 5 forms at least: compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So that's how I define reparations.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here. It's a complete privilege to be in this community. And Brother Chris, it's good to see you, everybody. Welcome. So there's 2 propositions here: reparations and this notion of racial equity. And reparations, to me, to put it simply, is about a response. It is a debt owed for the injuries that African Americans have incurred in the founding of this country and since. Racial equity issues are about, and those initiatives are about, the general promise that this country has presumably made to itself about what kind of country it would be. And so these are 2 very different, though of course related, issues. Reparations is about the injury that for whom the debt is owed to African Americans, injuries which ended up being foundational and continue to be part of the progress of this country. Racial equity issues or initiatives are meant to fulfill the promise of what the United States was meant to represent. And that is about the inalienable rights of all citizens of this country. And so those initiatives are meant to fulfill that promise. Reparations are about responding to the long owed debt for the injuries that African Americans have incurred for centuries.
Reverend Jeremy, am I next? Thank you. Let's see, I just want to add to what's been said and not repeat anything. I think the definitions of reparations that have been offered are spot on, and they are the way that I hold what reparations are. My line of work is racial equity. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because it's definitely not the same thing as reparations. But what racial equity is, the way that I practice it and the way that cities across the country are starting to practice it, beginning to practice it, is that it is connected to the history of this country. And that's what makes racial equity work in my field different from diversity and inclusion, because diversity and inclusion did not deal with the history of structural and systemic racism in this country. But racial equity work, when correctly practiced, absolutely is focused on structural and systemic racism. And that's how we started the work in Seattle, which is my hometown, and that's what made it different. That's what made it different, because it named racism, it named systemic racism, and it tied current conditions back to the treatment and mistreatment of African Americans and other groups in this country. So that is what makes racial equity and justice work different from diversity and inclusion. Now, is it always practiced that way? Of course not. The word equity gets used, and particularly in this particular moment, gets passed around quite loosely and used quite imprecisely. And so we do have that problem, that not everyone is holding racial equity work the way that we do here in Oakland. I want to just add to that it is on this continuum of progress in this country. Racial equity work, racial justice work is on the continuum of progress, this curve of the moral universe. And what it contributes to getting to reparations, which is a further outcome, right? What it contributes is the connection of history to current conditions. And we rely very heavily on that, because if we do not connect the history of what happened to us to the current conditions, then we misconstrue what is going on, and we will design the wrong approaches to fixing it. Because the dominant narrative in this country is, and always has been, that the victim is the problem, that Black people have done this somehow to themselves. And of course, even a cursory review of US history tells us otherwise. And that is a history that has been withheld from all of us. And it is part of the healing for Black folks to understand what happened. And it is part of the enlightenment. Randall Robinson was my earliest exposure to this thinking. So I'm thinking about how he would talk about, we cannot act on what we don't know. We cannot understand what we have not been taught and what we don't know. So true racial equity work, as I practice it, includes that part where we begin to relearn what happened in this country and begin that healing process, and also a different form of problem solving that is based on root causes, not dominant narratives, racist ideas about Black people and other people of color. So it's unpacking. And that's a step along the way toward building the critical mass and political will to actually execute reparations. Thank you.
So I believe I'm next. So I'll be very brief. Thank you all for this opportunity. It is an honor and pleasure to be here. I think what everyone said is extremely spot on. I think the only thing I'll add is, more broadly, we know reparations is about amending or atoning for historical and contemporary harms, right? And then in this domestic context, and even globally, but in this domestic context, it's about atoning or amending for, the institution of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and of course, the afterlife of slavery, whether that is, the broken promise of Reconstruction, Black codes, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and other badges and incidents and vestiges of slavery. And of course, to what Chris Lodgson said, under international law, we know that reparations comes in 5 forms. And those forms are compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition.
And Dr. Evans, if you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. And I will take just a moment to answer that general and opening question, but I want to recognize Allen Temple's public ministry, particularly Dr. Ali Whitehurst, and her graciousness for the invitation for me to join this very timely and necessary discussion. And to my colleague in ministry, Dr. Jacqueline Thompson, the esteemed pastor of Allen Temple. And as I'm hearing this discussion unfold, I think I would like to join Allen Temple. That's the most woke church in America. And I would love to be a part of Allen Temple. I heard Congresswoman Lee talk about the 13th was the most woke congressional district in the country, and that may be true, but I think it emanates from Allen Temple. And to my colleagues who are on this panel discussion. So I'm just going to define reparations in a very narrow way, or perhaps a general way, and make it a little more narrow. And I'm going to assume that the way I was introduced, I should talk about it from a systematic theological perspective, and then how to make that speak to people in, in homiletics or preaching. Theologically, whether it is the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible, that narrative unfolds as a justice motif. If I were to try to define Old Testament theology, New Testament theology, and where the nexus is, then it's going to be a justice motif. And I think more narrowly, it's going to be a reparations motif, particularly the Hebraic, Afro-Adenic Hebrew children when they were leaving the bondage in Egypt. They left with reparations. Passover, for example, you and I hear the word Passover, we think of bread and, and whatever we're doing around the Seder meal, or how it's been transformed into communion in the New Testament. But the real deal is, if you go back and read Exodus 12, Passover was really a justice motif, because Passover said we're leaving Egypt now and we're leaving with reparations. They left with gold and silver and so forth and so on as a payment for their 400 years of free labor. And so we know it is a biblical motif. But if I were to simply say this, I would even narrow reparations, not as the lawyers have spoken so well, and in addition to some of the scholars in other fields and other activists, it's just economic justice. That's what reparations is. And if there are modes and means to help us get there, then I think that's a good thing. But it's clearly economic justice. I'll turn it back over to you, Reverend.
Dr. Evans, I'm going to jump in here, and it is a pleasure to be a part of moderating this panel. I have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Evans. In reflecting on your book, Reconciliation and Reparation, would love to hear your perspective, now that you've defined for us your view of reparations being about economic justice. Would love to hear you speak a little bit more about kind of why reconciliation is an important aspect of reparations. And then what is the role, essentially, of the church in really addressing the issue of Black reparations?
Thank you, Council, and thank you for being so kind to help me further clarify. At least I will try to clarify what I think the role is. Here's a framework. So in the New Testament, particularly in the epistles where Apostle Paul comes on the scene, and by the way, Apostle Paul was perceived to be an Egyptian. If you read Acts chapter 22, Apostle Paul oftentimes has been whitenized, Europeanized, and become the hero of white-centric Christianity. But I think if we look at him in a very more narrow piece in the scripture, then he clearly would have been perceived to be a very dark man of hue. Now, having that said, he said that be reconciled in 2 Corinthians, etc. And he explains that it's exchange, change or exchange. It's used really as a legal term to our attorneys here. The New Testament binding is that reconciliation may mean that both sides may not agree on the outcome, but it has been settled. And I think that's kind of what reconciliation is. It doesn't mean that both sides will walk away feeling that they got all of what they wanted, but they are reconciled and bound to that particular decision, as it would be in in a legal case. It is so in the New Testament, it is considered in a legal form. Now, I want to just say this, and I'll say that I think, right, the justice motif, and when we talk about reparations, is really spiritual. And I want to define spiritual. I'm not talking about something that we're waiting on some medium to come and tell us what it means. But I think it is spiritual for me is political will, moral will, and ethical will. Political will would be in the place where Congresswoman Barbara Lee, by the way, Congresswoman, I'm digging that hat. And secondly, the next time I'm in DC, I'm going to meet you at 3rd and Penn, and I'll get you a latte at Starbucks. You know where I'm talking about. All right, we'll hang out over there. Yes, ma'am. But political will for me, I'm just going to broadly say, it's not only law, as in what some of our attorneys are doing, but also legislation in the deliberative branch of government, whereas in the House, where HR 19, HR 14, everyone doesn't agree with that. But do you really want to go about this without having HR 40 or HR 19? We would be losing leverage in the institutional spheres. I would say that people who teach in these institutions like higher learning, that's an institutional sphere. And so that's what I'm defining today as just very broadly political. But I would also say moral is, and this is my definition of moral, and this has come to me as I've gotten older. I think to be moral is to be empathetic to people. I think moral is to demonstrate that my humanity depends upon how I can be empathetic to someone else's humanity. It doesn't mean I have to agree with everything they're doing, because I may not even understand, but I do understand they're human. And if I can do that, you see, the real deal is that we got some folks in the European tradition that does not necessarily believe we're human. And therefore, they're living in a dehumanizing space of their own. It's ironic that when you deny someone else their humanity, you're really saying you aren't trying to be human yourself. But that's a role of being empathetic in the space of being moral. And I think ethics are pretty simple in respect to this. It's just what you ought to do. Ethics is basically defined in my field as oughtness and shouldness. I ought to do it and I should do it, right? And if we can approach justice motifs from that very loose framework, I mean, everybody on this panel can improve on what I'm saying, but what I'm giving us is a framework to decide that it is spiritual. It is a spiritual battle that I've defined as political, moral, and ethical, with those little subsets into it. I hope that kind of helps.
That does. Thank you, Dr. Evans. Thank you so much. I think Reverend Jeremy was going to have a follow-up question for our panelists to kind of get us involved in a dialogue with each other. So I'll turn it back over to you, Reverend Jeremy.
Perfect. Thank you again, Dr. Evans. And I was actually going to pivot to some of the state work that is being done. So this is specifically for Attorney Moore. California is the first state in the nation to create a task force to grapple with the questions of reparations. What is the task force charged to do, and how is the work progressing?
Yeah, great. Thank you for the question. So the task force scopes and powers are predicated on AB 3121, which is a legislative bill that was authored by California Secretary of State Shirley Weber when she was in the California Assembly. And it was signed into passage by California Governor Gavin Newsom in September 2020. And so the task force, which comprises of 9 members, which includes myself and my esteemed colleague, member Jovan Scott Lewis, we started to meet in June of last year. And so essentially, the Reparations Task Force is required to examine slavery that existed in the United States, discrimination in public and private sectors against those who were enslaved and their descendants, and the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery. And so the law also requires the task force to recommend how California will issue a formal apology, how to eliminate discrimination in existing state laws, and how to establish new programs, policies, or projects to address our findings. And then also the task force will also determine how any potential compensation should be calculated and who would be eligible, as well as any additional forms of rehabilitation and restitution. Since we've met in June, we've had a series of virtual public hearings on a variety of topics spanning from, of course, the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery, more contemporary harms against Black Americans, whether that's in banking, labor. We've discussed the racial wealth gap, anti-Black discrimination in the entertainment industry. We've discussed gentrification and homelessness. And just these past 2 days, we had a virtual meeting on anti-Black discrimination in technology, as well as a series of panels on health, public health, physical health, and mental health. And all of these videos are online at our website, oag.ca.gov/AB3121. I will put the link up in the chat shortly. And we've invited people to provide expert testimony from people like Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote the book Cast and Warmth of the Other Sons, to people. We've also invited people to provide personal testimony to share how, homelessness has impacted them, gentrification has impacted them. And so moving forward, and I'm sure my esteemed colleague can, share more information, but in February, we're having another hearing on February 23rd and 24th, where we'll, commemorate Black History Month, honor reparations advocates in the past, like John Conyers and Callie House, for instance. And then in March, we're going to have a virtual public hearing on the war on drugs, criminal justice, anti-Black hate crimes, and the criminal legal system more broadly. And so, I'll stop there, but we have an enormous charge, enormous responsibility that we're all taking quite seriously. And yes, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about the amazing work that you are sharing, that the task force is doing. I think we could listen to you all day to hear just more of the details of the great work. I'd love to follow up with Dr. Lewis, given your work on the task force. Would love to ask you a little bit of what we think is a provocative question. With California having joined in the Union as a free state and never officially sanctioning slavery, there are some people who ask, why is California focusing on Black reparations? So I'd love to hear your response to that question.
Sure, and that's fair. That is a provocative question. I think I'd answer by saying that we tend to think about slavery and place, right, as existing in what we can call slave societies, usually epitomized by the US South. And in these slave societies, right, slavery was a kind of driving and primary economic force, which then, of course, produced a kind of defining social and cultural environment around the practice. However, it's important to also include what we can call societies with slaves, so-called free states, which the state of California formally represented prior to emancipation and since the Compromise of 1850, when the state was admitted to the Union as a free state. However, in the history of California, we know that slave-owning Southerners traveled to the state with their enslaved as part of the 1849 gold rush. We also know that these slaveholders violated the prohibition against slaveholding and even traded slaves within the state. And so the question that your provocative question provokes is one about a kind of tricky issue of freedom and how we understand its place, because the argument is that California was a free state. And so that is somehow in contradiction to the notion of slavery and any responsibility related to African-American enslavement. So I wanted to quickly reference W.E.B. Du Bois, and in his book, Black Reconstruction, he wrote that in thinking and responding to the era of Reconstruction and thinking about emancipation, he wrote that the emancipation of man, right, is the emancipation of his labor. And what he was getting at was what I.D.B. Wells argued was how when emancipation came, the kind of interest of the white man in the Negro's body were lost. And so what Wells and Du Bois mean, what they're trying to get at, is that the position of the slave, meaning the function of the slave, had been radically disrupted. And so, and this disruption was about the actual position that the Black subject served in North American society. And so as emancipated or kind of lost labor value, right? No longer being a slave, the labor of the slave can no longer be guaranteed, and so it's therefore considered lost. What we can think of is that since emancipation, then, Black life has been socially and politically, and of course, economically and legally organized around how to recuperate this lost value. In other words, society has sought since emancipation to recover the value, the labor value specifically, of the once enslaved African-American. And so what we have to fully recognize, and more importantly to the question, track, is the foundational economic premise of slavery, which is the securing and profiting from the productivity of African Americans. And so even after emancipation, and especially since emancipation, we can see this pursuit of recovering this labor value, this productivity, in various practices, from convict leasing and sharecropping, even to some of the more present and pressing issues of eminent domain, mass incarceration. And because we are in the state of California, we are especially privy and impacted by the issue of gentrification. And so when thinking about these processes, what we have to understand is that all of them uphold the basic premise of African-American enslavement, meaning this recovery, this recuperation, but this mobilization of Black productivity. And so when we see the relationship as being one of productivity, meaning when we're seeing that the heart of enslavement is securing the productivity of African Americans, we understand that it is not just the injuries of African Americans that can be used to track the debts owed to them, but also the numerous and ongoing benefits that those injuries and their various iterations produced. And so when we think about the state of California, we have to think about, well, what exactly have been the benefits to the development of the state of California on the backs of the continued dispossession and injury making for African Americans. I'm here in Berkeley. South Berkeley was once a very well-developed, prominent African American community. But what we do know is that in the development of the BART system here, sorry, I'm in California, BART, right? That I learned if you put the before BART, you're in trouble. So before the development of BART, we know that a major requirement was the procurement of land to build the actual rail system. And so Ashby BART station, right, was made possible purely through the dispossession of an African-American commercial district and an African-American residential community. And so we have to think about that as being part of the long succession of inherited injuries that have been used to propel the development of the state of California, that injury-making capacity, that insistence on injury-making on the part at the cost of African Americans can be traced. There's a custodianship, in fact, of injury that can be traced through development, because we have to remember that slavery was an economic system of European development. It was an economic development practice. And so when we see that, when we pay attention to that simple fact, we can see that showing up across time and across geography, irrespective of the history of a state being so-called free or not.
Hello? Hello?
Thank you, Doctor. Is that Congresswoman?
Yes.
Sheila.
Yes.
Lee?
Yes. Yes.
Wonderful. It is good to have you. You're coming in, so do you have any initial remarks or thoughts?
Yes, I'm coming in and I will try to come back in, but because of the love and sisterhood of the descendants of enslaved Africans, and particularly my fellow queen, which is the Honorable Barbara Lee, I am on and standing in a corner of a church celebration that has been going on, and I'm up to speak. But I did not want to miss the opportunity because we're at a vital crucifix in the moment of history. And we're at a moment when I have been able to stand up and stood up because of sisterhood and brotherhood. That is really what HR 40, the Commission to Study Slavery and Develop Reparation Proposals, and HCON Res 19 that deals with reconciliation is all about. And what bothers me, and may I mind my manners to say, I'm delighted to be here, I'm honored to be here, but I wanted to give you the color of where I am in the corner behind the rostrum, if you will. And I'm speaking in this way so that I don't interfere with the ongoing presentation of a historic church. And Barbara may know that Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, the Reverend William A. Lodgson, Pastor Emeritus, and they are seated in the community, which is 3rd Ward. But I am fired up now because I am asking, as we are engaged in the diaspora, that we begin to understand that this is no time for those of us who've been seated on this continent of Africa to wear paper bags on our head. This is a time for us to recognize that it is not crumbs, but it is the recognition of the bloodshed and the service given to this nation and around the world. And I want us to be energized. We are now at a point where we have come further with HR 40 than we've ever come before. Over 300 organizations, a letter will be sent out this week, the national organizations, but we have not stopped at the 4 majors, such as the Urban League, the NAACP, National Action Network, the Congressional Black Caucus. We have seeded organizations that are mom and pop across the nation, obviously in PROBA, the African American Commission on Reparations, but we have color of change. We have organizations that people do not look to or heard of, but they are seated and working in the community. They recognize that all the work and planning that they have done, it is high time for the country, first of all, to acknowledge the sin and sinisterness of slavery, but as well to deep into the dive, if you will, of who we are and the trajectory of slavery that is impacting us as African Americans today. And so I wanted to, raise up an army to push the United States Congress, where we have 215 votes, the first time in the history of this bill did we get out of the Judiciary Committee with an enthusiastic vote, that we have Japanese Americans supporting us who received reparations in 1988. Bill was filed by John Conyers in tracking what happened for the Japanese, of which we rightly support. African Americans have been at the forefront of reparations for others our entire time in this country. We have stood by women who could not speak or were unempowered. We stood by Native Americans. We have stood by our Latinx brothers and sisters and Asian Pacific and others. And we do it rightly and grandly and strongly. I would never be anything else but someone who loved immigrant and non-immigrant, who loved the Caribbean and loved the continent, loved the United States and loved wherever we are. And so what I'm saying to you is we have done all this work. We have been heavy lifters. We have carried the burdens. We have led on faraway soil as men and women in the United States military. And we've come back to second-class citizenship. We now find ourselves in 2022 in a place where we are being used as fodder for divisiveness. We are being used to stretch the discontent that has nothing to do with the soil and the toiling that we did. Remember now, we have unnamed soldiers on the battlefield of civil rights that have never been honored. We have those who walked away from a plantation to go to a grocery store in the Deep South in the 1900s, in the late 1800s, and they never have been seen again. We have carried our share. So I do want to say that this commission will be part of Barbara and myself commitment to reconciliation. but it is also a law. It will be a law. It will demand the United States to study slavery and develop the reparation pathway. It is not a substitute. It cannot be a substitute for resolutions or a substitute for bills that want to commemorate, because it is law. It will be a law. It will for once and forever say that we acknowledge slavery, we acknowledge the generations of slavery, we acknowledge the people who first born, then lived and died in slavery and knew nothing else. They did not know the Emancipation Proclamation. So we're at a point in the United States Congress history that we need the power of all of you on this call, on this Zoom. We need you pushing toward and saying, we demand a vote on the floor of the House, or we demand a resolution. This does not step in the way of the appointment of, I hope and pray, the first Black woman to the United States Supreme Court. But I want to leave you with this message. Black people have to stop accepting substitutes. We have to stop accepting, well, we didn't get this, but they sure did give us this. We need a holistic approach. We need voting. We need police reform. We need the reparations. We need a holistic approach because we have been holistic in our service, commitment, bloodshed to this nation. So Barbara, I want to thank you for allowing me. I hear the music playing and they might be playing for me to tap back onto the stage. This particular church, as I said, has been in the movement. Dr. King spoke here, and I believe in honoring institutions. Right after that, I have a funeral to go to, and I'm doing testings and vaccination. But I tell you, the most important moment in this day is to be able to honor you and to tell you, I need you like I've never needed you before. HR 40 cannot stop in its tracks. And there are those who want to dance, tip, modify, stop. And we have been meeting. I'll finish on this. We have been meeting since 2020, every single Thursday, 300 organizations, terms of representation. I have held their hand, they've held mine, we have cried. We have said that we're going to be good Americans so that we can get this bill passed. We've now come to a point where the people have to lift us up. They got to push. They got to say, we're not a nation or a country or a people of substitute. We're not going to substitute this and then substitute that. You got this, and aren't you satisfied with this? No, we're going to pay tribute to our ancestors and honor them with HR 40. The Constitution says we have come together to create a more perfect union. They left me out, they left women out, Native Americans out, immigrants out. But the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment have put us in a place that we take the bags off our head and say, we too are America. Please help me pass HR 40, the Commission to Study Slavery and develop reparation proposals, as I stand by my sister, the Honorable Barbara Lee. Thank you so very much.
Thank Congresswoman Jacqueline Lee so much for creating time and standing with us and challenging us for a moment such as this. So as she departs, I'm actually going to come back to you, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and hopefully you can kind of give insight on where Congresswoman Jacqueline Lee stands as well regarding.
Sure.
Okay.
Before she leaves, yeah, I just wanted, as I started in my opening comments, talking about the movement to get HR 40 to the floor. Congresswoman Jacqueline Lee has brilliantly laid out the context, also the political context. And so right now, today, with California again leading, and I want to thank our participants on the task force, the members, because yeah, I'm really proud of California leading the way and all of the other local efforts that are really making the groundswell of the movement work. But this movement has to be translated now into supporting HR 40 and getting it to the floor and passing it. I mean, that's the bottom line. And Sheila, we talked about getting to members of Congress and just saying, look, sequence this so we can have a vote and have a vote as quickly as possible. And that's what it's boiling down to. I want to also say, in California, and I want to put this in a little bit of context of California, toward the end of that, when Congressman Conyers first introduced HR 40 in the late 80s, we went, I've been part of the Democratic Party forever, went to the California Democratic Party. The California Democratic Party endorsed HR 40 way back in the day. And so with our task force as a trendsetter and in the vanguard, it is up to us here, especially everyone affiliated with or members of Allen Temple, to really push California and our members of Congress to insist that we bring this to the floor. And Sheila knows exactly what I'm talking about. Secondly, let me just say, in terms of, and we haven't talked a lot about the generational trauma of enslaved Africans for 250 years and how this trauma, it was not only during the period of slavery, but has come down through the generations, through lynching and the Black codes and systemic racism and all of the issues we're talking about today. So that's an added piece that we have to always remember in terms of the trauma that is associated with how we repair that damage of the slavery, the legal institution of slavery. Also, I want to mention the fact that this is an international struggle. Also, this is the decade of people of African descent. Reparations is on the agenda of the decade of people of African descent. And I happen to be the representative to the United Nations. And finally, the UN has supported HR 40. And the rest of the world is looking at the United States once again to repair the damage and to move forward. Also, finally, I would just like to say to Dr. Evans, I hope to get a chance to meet you. I want, though, to bring some of my people of faith, my religious colleagues, so that they can listen to your brilliant presentation about the biblical context for reparations. They need to understand this very clearly. So I look forward to getting together with you in DC and explaining and drilling down as you have done so brilliantly here today. And yes, my church, I joined Allen Temple in the early 80s under the leadership of our beloved great Pastor Emeritus J. Alfred Smith Sr. But I joined the church because then it was the wokest church in the country and in my district, but in the country. And so I just want, because I'll have to leave in a few minutes, I just want to say thank you to everyone today for really continuing to be woke, for bringing in more people, whether they agree or disagree on HR 40 and how we move forward, at least having a discussion about repairing this damage of the historical past that has led to such injustices as they're manifested today in every single system in this American government, the private sector, local and state institutions. And so thank you all again so much for this. And I want to just thank our Secretary of State Weber, because California, whenever I speak about HR 40, I talk about the task force and how here in California, we finally have gotten our task force together to look at and develop reparations for African Americans. And so just know I'm very proud and honored. And we do have to stay very woke right now, because white supremacy is the order of the day. And we counter white supremacy by talking about what African Americans deserve as a result of building this country. And this is our way of moving forward and supporting HR 40. So let's engage in the political struggle also. And thank you all again so much. God bless you.
Thank you again, Congresswoman Lee. We appreciate you. We love you. And we just thank you for the continued fight and for joining us in this conversation. So we do have two more specific questions, but this will be under the umbrella of where do we go from here. Again, we see that the chat is very lively. We again ask that you govern yourselves with respect, with love and grace. Again, that this is a town hall to gain education and to gain connection. We are not trying to answer any the burning questions, and we're not trying to come away with we do want to come away with direct actions, but we are just using this space as a means of conversation and education. So to Ms. Darlene Flynn, we thank you again for being here. So this question to you, the city of Evanston, Illinois, has implemented what has been labeled by some as the first reparations initiated by a city in the form of a restorative housing program. Although some say this is mislabeled as reparations because it would do little to affect the enormous racial wealth gap that we've been talking about. Can you speak to anything that Oakland has done or is doing or should do to address the issue of Black reparations as a city?
Well, I think the city of Oakland has done some symbolic gestures in the direction of supporting reparations by passing a resolution that was introduced by then Council Member Lynette McElhaney, and to support the work that's going on nationally, as well as in our contracting practices, we require that bidders disclose whether or not the DNA of their organization involves profiting from slavery, and that is it's a disqualifier. So we've made the kinds of gestures that other cities have also made. I don't think we're the only ones. We don't have a reparations program because we don't have the trillions of dollars that it would take to repair the harm that has been done to African American people. Cities like Oakland, particularly cities with high Black populations or histories of high Black populations, is where the impacts of chattel slavery play out today on our streets and our communities. It is where the people are suffering and dying as a result of the impacts of chattel slavery. But we're at the bottom of the food chain when it comes to having the resources to provide reparations for those conditions that would repair those conditions. So what we are doing is more incremental and supportive. And I think there's more that we could be doing to be more active and more visible with regard to our demands for repair. And I think that the national conversation and the state conversation are very encouraging to those of us that care about justice in the state of California. But we have not yet manifest the actual steps that it would take to implement true reparations. So when cities like Evanston make these gestures that at least acknowledge that harm has been done and that something must be done to address it. And I think that's what our racial equity program does, because we are directly focusing on communities that have been disadvantaged by structural and systemic racism, which definitely centers Indigenous and African American people, no doubt. While we are doing that, we are furthering this mindset change that must happen in this country to understand what must be done to make it right. And I do believe that reparations is about making it right. And we have lots of thinking that has been going on now for decades by people smarter than I am about what that would look like. But we have done nothing as a nation to actually address those concerns and those needs. So the work that I do and that Oakland has committed to doing, and by the way, our racial equity activity is in our city code. It's not just a program, it's not just an idea in the city of Oakland. It was adopted by the city council as part of the city code. So we are working to infuse this idea of justice and fairness in everything that we do in the city of Oakland. So we are ready and prepared to be part of the answer, or we are getting ready to be part of the answer to the repair of the harms that were created by the history of this nation. But we do not hold all the keys to the mansion. So we have to be in collaboration with other efforts, and I think that's our main focus and our goal.
Thank you, Ms. Flynn, and definitely last but not least of our panelists to speak today before we open it up to a broader Q&A. Chris Lodgson, we'd love to hear about your experience as a community organizer and activist. We know you have encountered a lot of challenges in the effort to move the needle forward for Black reparations. I'd love to hear your perspective about some of these challenges and how can we work together as a community to overcome them?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, and I'm going to answer it directly. I also want to circle back to something that Congresswoman Barbara Lee said in response to an earlier question about the role of the church, because I want to point out a couple of things. First, I think what you're doing here is absolutely what we need churches and faith communities and faith organizations to be doing. So you're playing your role here now, and we need more of this. We need more of these kinds of conversations, and we need you to be talking more about reparations in your faith and in your services. The other thing I want to do is just call you to action as people of faith. If you go back to April of last year, during the first ever Judiciary Committee hearings, for HR 40, something that we heard from the people who are actually against reparations was really, really disturbing. They were making the point on national TV in front of a national audience, literally saying these words, that reparations are against the Bible, that reparations are not biblical. They literally said that multiple times. And I would be offended if I was someone of this church, as a member of this church, but just as a member of faith and someone of faith myself, very, very offended by hearing that. And so I think a call to action to those of us who know that reparations is biblical is in order. When you hear things like that, when people are saying things like that, we need you to stand up, rise up, and actually confront that kind of thing. So I want to get back to your question though. So I look at the challenges that we face as folks here on the ground who go out into our communities and talk to Black folks about reparations all the time. We have a two-piece problem, really. We have a people support problem or challenge, and we have a politician support challenge. And the people support challenge is more what I want to talk about, because that kind of breaks down into two kind of pieces. There's a Black people support challenge, and then there's a non-Black people support challenge. And when we talk to Black folks, the first thing we confront really is talking to Black folks about and really convincing Black people and getting Black people to see that this is even possible. There's a I don't believe this will ever happen kind of energy that we get when we first talk to Black people about reparations. And this is something that we have to get through. We have to believe that this is possible for this to actually happen. And this is one of the first things that we confront. And this is not nobody's fault, right? This is not something that we created. We've been here so long that we've been, kind of used to things not getting better for us. And so one of the first things that we confront when we talk to Black folks is, I don't even believe this is possible. I don't even believe this will ever really happen. And so that's a first part of the challenge. The second part of the challenge is really just raising awareness about what's going on locally, statewide, and also nationally when it comes to reparations. There's another piece of this too, which is that there aren't as many ways for Black folks to get involved in the reparations space and in the reparations fight locally as there need to be. There are a bunch of great groups that are developing now. I work for one of them. I work with one of them, Coalition for Just and Equitable California, here in California, that is doing a lot of that work. But there aren't enough ways for people to get involved in the fight for reparations locally yet. So those are some of the challenges we face on the people side. And then there's the politician, government official support problem too, which is a lot of the challenge too. And it's also a challenge of connecting those politicians and government officials to the actual people. There's a disconnection between our elected officials and the people. And this is also a part of the challenges that we see.
Thank you. You can see in the chat, there were a lot of amens to speaking to your perspective that you just shared. So practically speaking, based on those challenges, I'm going to start with you, Chris. What is your recommendation for just the community? Like, how do I as an individual, what are some call to actions that you would have for us as individuals?
Yeah, sure. So first thing I want you to do is send us an email, cjecofficial@gmail.com. Send us an email and say you want to get involved, and we will connect you to one of our local groups and put you to work for reparations right now. So that's the first thing. You can do that today. The second thing you can do is talk to somebody in your family about reparations today. Talk to somebody in your family about reparations today. The other thing you can do is you can actually participate in the California Reparations Task Force process, okay? The task force meets regularly. The next meetings are February 23rd and 24th. There's public comment for the first hour of every single meeting. You can voice your ideas and your thoughts about reparations and actually get involved in the process right now. You can also send your comments and your thoughts to the California Reparations Task Force right now. Also, you don't have to wait for the next meeting. You can do that right now also. But the main thing I want to say is find a local group like ours and connect with us, and we will put you to work right now.
Thank you. Those are some great calls to action. I I'd love to hear, there were some folks speaking in the chat. Attorney Moore, would love to hear your perspective as well. What is your charge to the community? And also, what can people do to educate themselves more about Black reparations?
I would just echo the sentiments of Chris. You can follow our website. I'll put that in the chat. We also have an email to Chris's point where you can email us any time of the day you'd like with your ideas, your concerns, your comments, your suggestions, and stay engaged, right? We also have a community engagement process that Member Show Grills has been just so talented in developing, right? So we have a community engagement process, which essentially would now, and I believe in September this year, going directly to the community to hear the community's thoughts and visions around you all to follow. You can also subscribe to our mailing list so that you can get updates for when we
Oh no, I think we had some connectivity issues. So Attorney Moore, we might need you to repeat what you shared, or we might need to get from you in writing what you shared, and we can send it out as a link afterwards to the audience, because you were sharing some really great nuggets and it broke up. We'll turn it over to any of the other panelists who have specific thoughts about, how people can get involved.
Attorney Melanie, can I ask a question?
Yes.
First, let me just say I am enjoying all of the conversation that's going back and forth in the chat. And for those who are concerned, please know we are familiar with Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore and ADOS. So for those of you who are in the chat who are referencing ADOS, please put the Oakland contact for ADOS. I would like to know from the panelists, because we recognize topics like this, not just this Voting Rights Act, anything that oppresses particularly Black people, sometimes there is a divide amongst us about what is the best road to achieve what we're trying to achieve. So if any of the panelists could speak to how can we continue to do this work without tearing each other down? We all have a role to play. We all have a part to play. So if your part is not the other person's part, don't knock them for doing their part. Just do your part. Right? And so that's why we are engaging this conversation. We certainly are not opposed. And actually, Alan Tipple can tell you, I've quoted Yvette Carnell. I love Yvette Carnell. She's addressed us as a Baptist convention, but how do we not, for any of the panelists, tear each other apart while trying to achieve the freedom and the reparations that is actually owed to us? Because that is symptomatic of something else within us.
I'd like to take a stab at that. And again, it's good to see you, Dr. Thompson.
You as well, Dr. Evans.
I'm so glad to see you. To the pastor's point, then we have to check our double consciousness. Real talk. I mean, when we have a goal for justice in front of us, and we don't want to take one or two or three different routes, avenues of approach. That's double consciousness. That's thinking in terms of esteem issues toward what we're trying to achieve. Brother Chris hit that thing when he talked about, he was talking about the psyche of us, Black folks, suggesting that, we don't even believe we can do this. That's a psychological depravity, to be honest. And we can do this. If we are paying attention, we can do this. Let me say this. William Darity, I think is still at Duke, a tremendous economist who has written precisely on these issues of reparations. His name oftentimes is mentioned among my ADOS brothers and sisters who have really helped us focus on the critical hour to get this done. And so that's one, view. And I'm not angry with people who want reparations for American descendants of slavery. That's a wonderful approach, and we should continue to press it. In addition to that, we have persons such as Sir Hilary Beckles, who was the Chancellor of the University of West Indies, who is also a tremendous economist. And he would say to us as African Americans, use your platform to help brothers and sisters in the diaspora. In other words, wherever Black people set our feet, we are oppressed. Our incarceration rates are higher than any other people group, wherever we are. And so Black oppression is a global phenomenon, right? So how do we come together to keep our eyes and ears and hopes and dreams on the ultimate goal? And that is economic justice, reparations, liberation, psychological freedom, spiritual renewing. That's just my idea today. You ask me tomorrow, Attorney Moore, I may have more to tell you, but today, that's where I am, because my objective is to get the boot off of Black folks' neck. That's what I want to see. And if it takes other people's approaches to help us do that, I'm in. But I'm not either or, I'm both and, right? But I think that's one way of looking at it. And then it's a demand for action to be taken. I'm going back to the action items that Brother Chris gave and Attorney Moore was trying to give us through interference. But whatever we do, there has to be a direct demand for action to be taken. And I will stop here. I would prefer, for example, voter rights today, like, in Washington, and holding up our voter rights. That's code language today for denying us economic rights. That's what that is, right? It's not just, can we vote? It's saying, we don't want you to vote because we know the next thing will be economic demands upon the nation. So let's try to keep these things in perspective. But let's boycott if they don't want us to vote. Don't buy this stuff. Just take a Cyber Day off. I guarantee if you do that, the next day they're going to get them voter rights straight, because we will literally stop the economy if we go on a Du Boisian general strike. I heard the professor, it was a professor from Cal Burke, was talking about Black Reconstruction. Well, I know a little something about that. Go to page 3 of Black Reconstruction, and Du Bois said, in theory, if Black folks, slaves, would have seen ourselves as workers as opposed to being slaves and went on a general strike, in theory, we would have destroyed slavery that day. Let's go on a general strike. Let's see what they can do without us in the economy.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Evans, for weaving that all back together for us. Wow. I know that we are now pressed for time. We are so grateful to our panelists for taking out the time to engage in discussion and to bring your authentic selves to this space as we really try to move forward and prepare our communities, educate our communities, so that when we move forward, everyone is at least on the same page. We may be writing with different pens, but at least we're writing the same story. Amen. So I want to toss it over to my wonderful co-chair really quickly, Dr. Allie Whitehurst, if she had any closing comments, remarks before we pray out.
Wow, do we have to go now? Unfortunately, we do. Many of you submitted questions when you registered. We will hope to respond to you. We will respond to you. And there's a survey. We want you to complete a survey before you sign off today. And we really talked about action. So we will be working on a petition, and we will be getting that out to you as well. And you've heard other ways that you can engage. And it's really, really important that we do so. And we must come together. I kind of monitored the chat, and we all have our different views and our different opinions, and that's okay. But we must get behind HR 40, no matter what we think of it, with its flaws. We must support the work of the California Reparations Task Force. Otherwise, another 400 years will pass, and we will still have the same conversation and wonder why. So thank you so, so very much for joining us today. And I will turn it back over to you, Reverend Jeremy. Thank you, and Attorney Melanie, for leading our panelists in such great, great conversation. Thank you all so very much. We have to do this again.
As with every one of our town halls, we see we got to start doing some part ones and part twos, and so we will definitely go back to the drawing board again, and hopefully we can get a conversation with ADOS, and we can continue this conversation. Like we've said from the beginning, this is only the beginning regarding how Allen Temple, as we are galvanizing and preparing our communities for such a time as this. And I definitely want to shout out our public ministry team and Sister Carol Tolliver, who has been the main researcher behind reparations, and she is the main catalyst for creating this moment. So we love you, Sister Carol. We thank you for your work. We see you, we appreciate you, and we look forward to continuing with this conversation. I know that we are over time, but we do just want to offer the panelists 30 seconds, no more, no less, if you have anything burning, just to want to get off your chest. So just 30 seconds to our panelists for closing remarks. And we can start with you, Ms. Flynn.
Thank you, Reverend. I think I would just end by emphasizing something that has come up before, and that is that a part of this journey is in our own minds and what we believe is possible. And part of we lost more than money. We lost a lot through chattel slavery. We lost a lot of our ability to see ourselves as meaningful in this society. So this healing journey that we have is so important to our being able to work together. And it's something we have complete control over. We don't have to wait for the systems to change for us to come together. So just want to encourage people to keep talking about the differences of opinion and working toward the idea that we can do this together. Thank you.
Brother Chris?
Yeah, first I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to thank Carol for the invitation, Dr. Whitehurst. I want to thank everybody, the panelists, the moderators, the people who are making this happen. The only other thing I want to say is I want to add to what Kamilah Moore was saying about how else you can get involved now too. There are going to be community meetings and community listening sessions happening all across the state of California this year and probably next year too, hopefully next year too. But for sure this year, there are going to be community listening sessions coming to your community soon about reparations. So find out where those community listening sessions are happening. You can find out at the official website of the California Reparations Task Force. You can also send us an email, cjecofficial@gmail.com. Get on our email list and we will send you the information about where you can show up in person and actually contribute to what's going on for reparations in your community right now. This is the year. Thank you.
Attorney Moore?
Am I still in the matrix? Can folks hear me?
We hear you.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say thank you all for the opportunity. It was an honor and a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to staying connected and continuing this conversation. And I always, appreciate these conversations when they're rooted in faith. So thank you.
Dr. Lewis.
Yes, again, thank you for having me here today. It's been really an honor and a privilege. I want to just say that I think in addition to the kind of response to the centers of injury, reparations, I think, holds a promise for two things. One is to finally establish a firm foundation for African-American self-determination. And two is, and this kind of goes to some of the earlier comments around some of the contention that we're seeing, is that it is finally giving the African-American community its own basis for self-definition. It's important to note that African-American community in this country has been externally defined. And so reparations opens up the door finally for this community to determine the terms of belonging, to determine, again, the terms of what the horizon for that community looks like. And so I just want to note that amidst some of the contention and amidst some of the challenge, that framing one's identity and framing one's future is difficult work, and it does require a little bit of bickering. But nevertheless, this is what reparations holds as two fundamental promises that really and truly have never been allowed to the African Americans in this country. That was the failed promise of Reconstruction, and reparations is now hopefully going to finally put that promise on the table and firmly within the grasp of the descendants of enslaved Africans in this country who've been working towards not just freedom, but self-determination for centuries.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. And Dr. Evans.
Thank you. And Reverend Jeremy, you've been a tremendous moderator, and I appreciate you giving us some free flow. And Dr. Lewis, that last response you made really sums everything up that I could possibly determine to say. But I would like to simply add, I wrote in my notes that, and I meant to mention, and I'm sure all of you have read, at least on our panel, but perhaps otherwise, Mary Frances Berry wrote a tremendous book on Callie House. I don't know if you all read that, but Callie House really is a hero of the reparations movement, I would think. Heroine, she was like way ahead of her time. And I think if you haven't read her work, Mary Frances Berry, about Callie House, I think that is a tremendous place to start. I think Callie is still doing it. And I think Allen Temple is still doing it. And I'm going to have to get back out to Cali to be a part of what's going on. And I appreciate so much. And let me know when you all in Atlanta, and come by the Morehouse School of Religion and come to the AUC, and we'll be glad to have you. And peace, love, and soul.
Bless you again, Dr. Evans. And I'm Morehouse class of 13, so we holding up the banner strong.
And I'm talking about, I thought you were a Morehouse man.
You can tell us, but you can't tell us much. Amen. So with that, we are going to close. We thank everyone again for coming out. And I want to lift up Micah 6 verses 6 through 8 as our closing charge and as our closing prayer. Hear the word of the Lord. How can I stand up before God and show proper respect to the high God? Should I bring an armload of offerings topped off with yearling calves? Would God be impressed with thousands of rams with buckets and barrels of olive oil? Would God be moved if I sacrifice my firstborn child, my precious baby, to cancel my sin? But Yahweh has already made it plain on how we are to live and what to do. What God is looking for in men and women is quite simple. Do what is fair and just to your neighbor. Be compassionate and loyal in your love. And don't take yourself too seriously. Take God seriously. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and most of all, carrying out of God's word. In the words of Dr. Evans, peace, love, and soul. And we will see you. Stay on, do the survey. We will be in contact with you all, and look forward to part 2 in our fight for and towards reparations. God bless you. God keep you. That is our prayer.
Peace, love, and reparations.